Welcome to Digital Transformation in the Catholic Church, bringing truth and hope in the modern age. My name is Billy Atwell. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the Diocese of Arlington. In part one, we heard from Archbishop Vigneron of Detroit and Bishop Michael Burbidge of the Diocese of Arlington, and they spoke about communications. Each had written a pastoral letter on the topic, and so here in part two, we're going to be expanding a little bit on what they said and thinking back to some of the points that they made. And we have a panel of experts with us here to do just that. So first we have Father Charles Fox. He's the Vice Rector and Dean of Seminary and Formation at Sacred Heart Seminary. He's also a frequent contributor to Catholic World Report and other publications. We have Kresta, President and CEO of Ave Maria Radio. He's the host of Kresta in the Afternoon. He's also a noted author and journalist. We have Teresa, Tomeo, host of Catholic Connection, an author, speaker, and a media expert. And we have Erlandson, Director and Editor-in-Chief of Catholic News Service. He's also the former president and publisher of our Sunday Visitors Publishers Division. Thank you all for participating in this. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
When we think of the last 30 years alone, we could even say it's maybe a shorter window than that, we've seen this evolution where we've had the time-tested mediums of radio and print and these things, and we still have those, but we've seen this transition to where there's also this digital media element that has come into that same world. Obviously that involves social media, Facebook and Twitter, but we have internet websites, blogs, all kinds of things that are at our disposal. Al, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind. How does the medium impact the content? You've been in radio for a long time, but you've also written books. So how does the way we communicate something impact maybe what we're saying?
Yeah. One of the things you'll learn pretty quickly if you write and speak is you realize writing and speaking are different things. So if you're going to write for a book, it's different than you're writing for a lecture or for a talk. And we have to be always be respectful of the medium we're using. So, today we've got such a proliferation of different media. Sending a text message is different than sending an email. There are certain requirements that a text message has that email doesn't. Twitter has a limitation on character. You can't get nuance or context in Twitter messages. But this is something which media experts have studied ever since at least 1964, when Marshall McLuhan gave us that Understanding Media book with the great slogan, "The medium is the message." Something that has changed, though, drastically since I began doing radio mid-1980s is the rise of the internet empowered listeners and callers in a way that they weren't empowered before. I can remember the first 10, 15 years of being on the air. I took calls all the time from listeners wanting answers to questions. And I was, I had a large library, I was pretty well read, and so it was something I was able to give that I thought was a strong suit of mine. Once people began using the internet, they don't have the same kind of questions they used to have. They can go online, and with a few keystrokes, they've got the answer to their question. I had a good friend, a little younger than myself, who was a member of the church I pastored. He began considering the claims of Catholicism. The natural thing would have been for him to give me a call. We'd spend time talking. But instead, he ended up being received into the Catholic Church with only one or two conversations. Almost all of his information gathering came through internet searches. That's how he found himself coming into full communion with the Catholic Church. So I think that's one thing that has changed drastically. The other thing that's changed is in 1987, Rush Limbaugh began to become a national phenomenon. And I think there's absolutely no doubt, as brilliant a broadcaster as he was, as humorous as he could be, there's absolutely no doubt that he opened the door to the kind of name-calling, sarcasm, satire, which has come to characterize talk radio, largely conservative talk radio, but you find it on the liberal side too. Most talk radio is conservative talk radio. Rush was a name caller, for all of his virtues. You never did that. And I think since that time, there's no doubt that communication in talk radio format is is much crasser than it used to be. Anyway, things have changed in 30 years, and I think that while listeners are better equipped to get the information they need, and they're not as reliant upon hosts, at the same time, hosts have been given opportunity to debase the currency of language in the way that they treat political figures and other leaders in our culture and in our church. And I don't think that's necessarily been a good thing at all.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you say that, because in the same time period is the Howard Stern phenomenon, and
Yeah,
he was
that's right.
hugely popular. So there was this kind of like, the lower we can drag it, the more ads you can sell, the more listeners you
Yeah.
might drive, and that became the litmus test of success rather than quality of content and what's being produced. Teresa, you were nodding your head a lot through this. I don't know if you had anything you want to throw in there.
Well, because prior to coming to Catholic media, I worked in the secular media for 20 years, and you mentioned Howard Stern and Bell went off, because I can remember. And Al and I, we've talked about this. When I was still working in radio, my last job before I came over to Catholic media was as a news director for an FM station. And the FM station was adult contemporary. And we had a morning disc jockey who was a pretty decent guy and came from Chicago, so he had a lot of major market experience. But with the influence of the Howard Sterns in the world, he was being pressured to do more and more sexual content, more and more name calling, as Al was saying. And so you really saw that approach.
Greg, you're an optimist, I know, so I want you to share with us, if you would. When you look ahead as this thing continues to evolve, because you've worked in media for a long time and you're with the Catholic News Service, so you're getting good, I think, visual on the media world and the landscape that's there. What do you look forward to, and what do you see kind of hope and excitement about as this continues to evolve?
Well, actually, I'm only slightly an optimist when it comes to this topic. I think there's strengths and weaknesses, pluses and minuses to all that. But I think one thing is that the digital age has really granted access. It's democratized access. Absolutely. A way to speak to people. You know, anyone can run a podcast. It's very low barriers to entry. Immediacy is another issue. I think that idea, for example, journalists now have to be on Twitter. They have to be there to find out immediately. It used to be a news event would happen on day one, you reported it on day two, and you analyzed it on day three. Now, on day one, you better have your analysis ready and jump into it, which is, I think, one of the problems. Journalism has less time to be reflective, less time to do research. And another part, I think, might be accountability, that people get feedback immediately, and they can ask for accountability. So it's part of that access point. You can chase after someone that you're criticizing, for example, which isn't always done in a mean way, but it's something that happens, again, immediately. And then the final thing would be community. I think that we're so hungry for community these days, and the digital environment, for all of the problems that it can have, can provide ways of people to develop community. And I think that's something we'll have to see how that balances out with some of the negatives that we'll talk about.
Yeah, and it's funny, Bishop Burbidge mentions that in his pastoral letter, kind of going back to part one of this, is that there's a loneliness effect that can be created with social and digital media, where it's not real community, but it does create supplement. And so when we've gone through a pandemic and those kinds of things, it can create a sense of connectedness. My wife's grandparents are able to see photos and videos and things they probably wouldn't otherwise see. We wouldn't be hooking up VHS tapes, making it, and then sending it to them if we were going with the more traditional media. So they're able to access things that they otherwise wouldn't. And the same is true with news and analysis and those kinds of things. One thing that both Bishop Burbidge and Archbishop Vigneron mentioned in their in part one was that a lot of what people know about the Catholic Church and Catholics in general, people who embody and live out the faith, is through mainstream media, and that's not always good. So Father Fox, let me start with you, maybe just from a kind of a pastoral perspective. How would you describe the portrayal of the Church and Catholics in general through mainstream media?
It's often unfair, often uninformed, and yet we have to be careful not to give in to a kind of whining about mainstream media coverage that itself can be corrosive of the Church's life. Our Lord gives us the model of putting up with a lot, he submitted and opened not his mouth. So on the one hand, a certain reflective silence is required in the face of this on the part of the people at large. Now, I'd have a different answer with regard to Catholic media. But I think for your typical pastors and people, abandonment to divine providence is a strong part of our spiritual heritage that I think we need to recapture in the face of such tumultuous times and attacks on the church. And also to recognize that we're following Christ when we take these things magnanimously, which means with greatness of soul, that we trust in the Lord to bring us through this. And then with regard to Catholic media and the way people engage with digital media, whether it's in comment boxes or in, their own personal blogs or whatever, to speak the truth and to speak with authenticity, which might sound like it's the same thing, but it's not just about saying things that are true. It's also about saying them without manipulation, because I think that's what people feel over and over again from the mainstream media, is that they're being manipulated into a certain position, a certain way of thinking,
There's an
a certain way
agenda
of
there.
speaking, that there's an agenda and a vocabulary that goes with it, and all of it's mutually reinforcing. And so part of the beauty of this democratization that Greg talked about is that people are able to speak with a freshness. They're outside of that vocabulary and those patterns of speech. And so they speak with a new vitality and give simple witness to the truths of the faith that can be really beautiful and build up the body of Christ.
Could I jump in just for
Yeah.
1 second? I want to pick up on the point that Father talked about with the whining. I think that's really important, because what Al and I try to do, and I know that most of us, I think, in Catholic media are working to do this, and this is what I loved about the pastoral notes from the bishops, is to help people understand how to discern media properly. And we can be a real tool in that area. And Al and I have found ourselves doing more and more secular media interviews when a Catholic story arises to help explain something within the faith. Because having been in newsrooms most of my life, unfortunately, many people, and I was one of them before I came back to the church, I was identified as a Catholic, but I didn't know much about my faith. I knew the basics, but even that was limited. And so it's an opportunity for us to educate. The reaching out and having some patience. But I think we also have to politely call them out when they do make major mistakes, because that leads to a lot of misinformation, and it can have an impact on evangelization if the church is, if people are only getting their information from the secular media and they're not understanding what the church is all about.
Yeah.
I can just reinforce Teresa's point from a pastoral perspective. It's really essential to call them out in those instances, because it contributes to that work of building media literacy that you were talking about.
Right.
And that formation's essential. I mean, I have conversations all the time in which my main task as a pastor is to help people read media reports with appropriate critical literacy, and just to help them interpret what they've read or heard. And so I think the work that you're doing is really essential.
Do you remember the story a couple of years ago? This was during, you probably remember this, and I think Al and I, we talked about it. You were probably still in seminary at this time. I don't know. I know you're very young, but well, under during Benedict's pontificate, when he was, it was during the ordinary time, and it was during one of the audiences, and he had green vestments on. And so I think it was the Associated Press who actually reported, because there was a story, the church was working on something within the Vatican about the environment. They were doing something to some of the buildings. I can't remember the specifics. But I think it was the AP who actually reported, or another major news service, not the Catholic news service, it was you guys. They actually said that Benedict goes green. And the writer, and they weren't just alluding to the topic. They were alluding to his vestments, and they actually mentioned that in the story. Remember that?
Yeah, I do.
So this is a type of misinformation, and something so basic, something that, so anyway, there's a lot there.
So at the very least, someone thought that and went with it. What would be worse is if someone reinforced it for them, a source. They talked to a source and they said, that's exactly what's happened there.
I think from the point of view of the Catholic press, sometimes there's frustration when they think that church leaders are only focused on how they appear in secular media, and they wish there was more directed to them.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think it really is for church leaders and for Catholic journalists, they have a responsibility to interact with the secular press and not close all the doors to them, because then you have no one to blame but yourself.
Exactly. That's a
Absolutely.
great point.
Absolutely.
Great point.
Mainstream press, for the most part, do not have religion reporters.
Yeah, that's true.
Not anymore,
Not anymore.
It's
Right.
amazing. You would expect that the New York Times was doing a story on inflation or recessions, you would expect they'd have somebody with an economics background writing the story. That's not what they do with religion stories. They pawn it off to whoever's available. And you get some outrageous reporting as a result of that. You mentioned the Benedict story. I was thinking of another one too. When he went to Cameroon, he went into Africa, this is back in March of 2009. And on the plane, somebody asked him about the spread of AIDS in Africa.
Oh, I remember
this one?
Yep.
Spread of AIDS in Africa. And he didn't have a statement prepared, but the question of condoms came up, and he kind of offhandedly said, well, that's not helping. That's not helping the problem. Well, that became the focus of his trip to Cameroon, that the Pope was against condoms. And because he was so in bondage to the rules, the Pharisaical rules of the Catholic Church, he's letting people die in Africa. There was one woman in particular who made the rounds, don't recall her name now, but what was frustrating about that moment is that 10 days later, the Washington Post ran a column by Dr. Edward Green, who headed up Harvard's AIDS Research Division. And his column made it clear that they've never been able to stem the tide of AIDS throughout Africa through the use of condoms. And he said, actually said in the column, the Pope was right. I've never heard that column referred to. I'm the only one I know who has actually used that column over and over again.
But again, that wasn't reported as news. That was a column. So it comes across as this is opinion, but it's a scientific reality based on what he's seeing in statistics. Father Fox, you made an interesting point about kind of authenticity and truth going hand in hand. Greg, I'm curious your thoughts on this. The concept of Catholic media, we know what we mean by that, but when we started the Searching for More podcast in Arlington, one of the first people I interviewed, he's there in town, was Raymond Arroyo, and he said he was suspicious of the phrase Catholic media because he feels like there's an implied agenda with that is not what we're intending to communicate. I don't share that, but I thought it was an interesting thought because it reflects this idea of we're obviously coming at this truthfully and honestly, but when we differentiate between Catholic and secular media, there's some differentiators there, one in business model, which we'll go through in a second, but what do you see as the purpose of Catholic media and just that general thought of the authenticity that goes with it?
I think that Catholic media, ideally, the people are well formed in the faith and they're reporting effectively, efficiently, and correctly on what's being said. Now, there's can be a lot of exceptions to that. When Al was talking earlier about people looking up answers to the faith on the internet, that can be really a mixed bag. You just hope that they're going down the right alleyway.
Right.
But I think that's one of the things we've seen. For example, if you look at the Pennsylvania report on sex abuse in Pennsylvania and how that story was treated, and it was only a Catholic journalist, Peter Steinfels, 5 months later, who really dug into the whole report and
Used to be with the
realized
New York Times. He was a religion reporter.
he was a religion reporter for the New York Times. He was, that's true. He had that background, but he did all the necessary research, and someone was willing to pay him, or he was willing to take the cost on of doing that research, and really exposed it as a pretty shoddy report. And there was a lot of things they buried in the hundreds of pages of footnotes at the end. He was writing in Commonweal when he first published that report. I think that's one of the kind of things that Catholic press can do. They can hold people accountable, and they come at it knowledgeably. The danger that I think we're all facing is that the Catholic press itself can be ideologically polarized and divided, and then we're not doing a service to anyone. The news media is all about trust. And trust is in short supply these days across the board in this country.
Teresa, how does the difference between Catholic media and secular media get impacted by the business model? Because what we have is this kind of clickbait, fear-mongering type thing we often have from secular media, where they need people to click that link because that's the revenue, is literally in the click and seeing the ads. Whereas with Catholic media, it's almost all driven by donors who support the mission of what you're doing, not just that story and clicking where they're offering really nothing but just kind of general viewership and interest. With Catholic media, it's funded by the mission behind it, which
Right.
I know you all do a lot here at Ave Maria Radio. That's you do drives to get people to contribute, and that's a much harder thing to get people to do than click on a Facebook ad with a really attractive photo or really sensationalized
Right.
headline. How does that impact the quality of the media? Because you come from a secular media
Well,
background.
it's huge, and we call it now fear porn, but in my day we called
Yeah.
it if it bleeds, it leads. And,
Yeah.
and it's the same thing. And people don't realize that, and Al and I talk about this all the time when we do our media segments, it's a business model. Making money is a business model, and that's why fear is so rooted in the way they cover story. The other thing, too, picking up on Greg's point and what you were saying earlier, the big difference is in Catholic media, people know we're Catholic. We can write out and say, we are Catholic and we make no bones about it. We're here to educate on the faith. We're here to enlighten and engage. Secular media, for the most part, still try to claim that they're a secular operation.
Neutral on these things.
operation.
Well, yeah.
You know, which
Not
just
true.
doesn't exist anymore. And,
Right.
and that's not fair to the viewing public, and so or the reading public, which is a big difference. Don't you think?
Yeah, I
Right.
do. And I think people don't mind if you have an agenda if it's clear.
If you're open about it.
I mean,
right?
we're Catholic
Right.
media.
Yeah.
What makes us Catholic media is that we are concerned for the mission of the church. And we try to keep that in mind with the work that we do. We wanted to advance the overall mission of the church. And there's also part of the problem I think people have is when they think of Catholic media, they simply think of Catholics becoming clannish and kind of just talking to themselves, which of course we do need to talk to ourselves. But we should always be thinking, this I would love to stress this to everybody involved in, quote, Catholic media, would people outside the faith listening to you right now, would they find this conversation winsome, attractive, truth-telling? Would they see something gracious here, beautiful? Would there be something to move them to act nobly? I think we should always keep in mind that as Catholic media, we certainly know we're primarily broadcasting to Catholics. But we ought to be able to talk about what we're doing in a way that if unbelievers happen to watch what was going on, they would be kind of surprised that this is kind of interesting. It's like a world we haven't tasted or
Right.
visited before,
Right.
you know?
Greg, I want to build up a point that you made before, is that anybody can start a blog or a podcast or a website. You don't have to be particularly well-formed in the faith to suddenly become a Catholic blogger or a Catholic whatever. Should there be some sort of monitoring or some sort of vetting service or some sort of universal standard for identifying authentic Catholic media from those who are maybe either have really kind of corrupted agendas or aren't really qualified to be speaking about it? I don't have an answer to this. That's not a setup. It's just kind of a genuine question of,
I think
is there
Bishop
something we can do about
should
it?
do that. No,
Don't sign me
Or
up for more
Archbishop
work.
Bigger. We'll let them both handle that one.
everyone wants that for different agendas. Even at the USCCB, I've heard that complaints come in from both sides.
Right.
I want them shut up. I want them shut up. It's really hard. I mean, if it has the name Catholic, the bishop can step in and
Right.
make a judgment there about whether
Yeah.
it should have the name Catholic or not. Some people have looked at the Catholic Media Association, which used to be called the Catholic Press Association, but they don't really have the means to do that if it's not violating
Right.
some basic standards of decency in journalism. Especially if the publication has some support from a bishop.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that, again, getting back to the beautiful notes that the bishops gave us, discerning, a sense of discernment. I mean, we're all experienced media people, and so we have because we were educated in it and we know how to spot things. But I think if people look to the church, and this is why these letters are so important, in terms of how do you discern what's coming at you, all the information. Latest statistic I saw was that adults are consuming about 11 hours of media a day. And so what are they consuming, how are they consuming it, and how is it affecting them? When I do my media panels and my media talks, I tell people, not to sound like a psychotherapist, but when you're on a particular website, and this could be holding true for a secular media outlet as well, how do you feel? What's your sense of peace What's your sense? What are you getting being on this particular website? Does it make you feel that, okay, this outfit is actually, or outlet is actually covering the church fairly? It gives me some good news, gives me some bad news, but it's good because I'm informed. I don't feel like I need to, the sky is falling and warning, warning, Will Robinson, danger approaching, that kind of thing. There are some sites out there that are nothing but always negative, always attacking, and find nothing good in the church. And around every corner is the bad priest or the bad bishop that's just out to get, whomever.
And, this is something to keep in mind. I'm going to tell a story here, which I think is pretty important. This goes back maybe 7-8 years ago. A young man had been writing for this independent Catholic media outlet, and he quit. And he quit because he had been doing profiles of bishops, and he had done in this case, it had been a profile of Archbishop Dolan, and these were meant to be hard-hitting, bring up the dirt kind of things. So he did a lot of that, but he also said, I don't know exactly what he said, but he said some positive things about Archbishop Dolan. The editor said, look, let me tell you, returned the report to him twice, then called him into the office, said, listen, let me tell you, we say nothing positive about the bishops here. That is the policy. We say nothing positive about the bishops.
That's chilling.
Yeah.
Oh.
And,
But it's true. It's an absolutely true story.
and they want to maintain a certain level of outrage. And it's that outrage which has, I think, an addictive quality to it. Then they drive it, and it's amazing because they can say the stupidest things, right, that turn out not to be true, or they can have the most stupidest analysis. One time in this particular media outlet, it was after back in the August of 2018, just after the McCarrick story broke, and there were concerns about Cardinal Wuerl. And so this was just towards the end of August. A friend of mine called me and said, you got to see this story. It's all about what's going on with Cardinal Wuerl. So I went, got the story, looked at it. The story claimed that Cardinal Wuerl had hidden himself from the public, and he was waiting for the Holy Father to come up with a way to spirit him away from the United States because they wanted to escape RICO charges that were going to be brought against the Catholic Church. And so I'm thinking, what? What? So I went through and looked at every assertion there of so-called fact. The only facts in the piece were that Cardinal Wuerl had missed 2 public meetings. Nothing
And
else.
that was it. It was all fake.
It was all, this person wasn't even, he said, according to my sources, didn't even say my sources at the FBI or my sources, just
Right.
according to my sources. It was probably a
Just
buddy.
people in the ether, right?
Yeah, right.
A buddy called him and said,
Or no one at all.
might this be true? Oh yeah,
Yeah.
might be true. Yeah, right.
Right.
According to my sources.
Yeah.
It was terrible. And the person who told me to follow that story was a person with an earned doctorate who was incredibly competent in this person's field of study. And I was stunned that this was recommended to me. Why would people be attracted to that over the long haul? All I can think of is that feeling of outrage also plants within you kind of a secret of knowing, having an angle on things
And
that the other
superiority.
people don't
Right,
see.
right.
Yeah. But I think it's devastating to the church's witness, and I don't think, I think the bishops, I like what you said, the bishops do have responsibility for the name Catholic, but I think they're kind of limited. In America, for them to, press down and try to destroy organizations like this, it's a boomerang effect.
Right,
They're going to come
right.
back, and
Well,
and
someone
it's always
would
the
wear it
big
as
guy
a
that's going to look bad.
And some would wear it as a point of pride too.
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
depending on what it
exactly.
is. The types of things that would get them in trouble with their own bishop are the things that that actually would make them feel like, hey, see,
right.
I'm doing the
Yeah.
Lord's work. Clearly, my bishop's angry at me.
Yeah.
But one thing I would point out from Archbishop Vigneron offered 5 warning signs for problematic use of media, and those are so good because it's almost like your little pocket 10 commandments. Like, am I
Yeah.
falling into any of these traps? Am I doing any of these things? Because I think it can be helpful for people.
Yep.
Father Fox, you were going to say something.
Sure. I was just going to say that, at the heart of communication is binding people together. I mean, communication at its root has the same etymology as communion and community, and it's all about being bound together. And so, the word divisive sometimes gets thrown around in unhelpful ways, because sometimes the truth of the gospel, as our Lord says, is going to, separate a father from his son and a mother-in-law from her daughter-in-law, etc. I mean, it's going to create a certain amount of tension and even at times conflict. Standing up for the truth of Christ is challenging, but ultimately it's supposed to bring us together into union with Christ and to union with each other.
But one thing that's, I think, certainly negatively impacted the credibility of the church and reputation of the church and made communication much harder has been the abuse crisis. We've kind of had 2 phases of it, right? The 2001, 2002 crisis, and the most recent with the Mayor Carrick report, the Pennsylvania grand jury, and so on. And so a lot of people are filtering their views through that heartache. Even if they're not Catholic, their perception of the church is certainly impacted by that. In our diocese, we just had a listening session for the Synod of Bishops, and a young lady got up to the microphone and said, the church, she's been, I think, fallen away Catholic was kind of what I gathered from what she said. But she said, the church had this sex abuse crisis, and it never dealt with it. It never addressed it. Now, as a communications director for the last 11 years, my head almost fell in my hand, like weeping, thinking I've wasted all this time.
Yeah,
right. What have you been
Doing
all
nothing but
these
trying to
years?
show
Right.
what the church has been doing and working with my bishop on that. But at the same time, I can't blame her at all for not having heard it or witnessed it. I mean, it drove her away from the church, and then she's not there to hear it. So there's a tragedy in that. But Father, when we see in the media these misrepresentations of the church, like nothing's been done, we know lots have been done. You work with seminarians. The screening for seminarians is radically different than it was in years past. So you kind of live in your work the reality of these changes. But how should we respond, just from either emotional or spiritual, when we see these falsehoods asserted, whether it's from people who just don't know better or people who do know better? How should we be kind of spiritually responding to
I think
that?
we need to respond with personal humility and with boldness for the gospel. That we boldly proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and that Christ has given us the gift of the church, the gift of this community of faith, and we don't apologize for proclaiming the truth of the gospel and the truths about humanity to which, about which God has enlightened us.
Yeah. I remember Father Mike Schmitz told a story one time where he had been kind of verbally accosted in a supermarket for being a priest, and they called him a pedophile or something like that. And he said he reflected on it and he thought about it later, and he said, I really didn't deserve that. I've never done anything that would warrant that kind of treatment. He said, but you know what, neither did the victims.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we kind of joined his sorrow and I think anger to an extent of what happened, and said, then I get to join my sorrow to theirs, and together hopefully we can pray and get closer to God through it, and make the best of that situation the most you can.
I think we're also going to have a time to really sum up this year, because this will be the 20th anniversary of the charter and the revelations that came out in Boston and everything that came from it. And the church would really miss out on a chance to say this is all that we've done. And especially the American church. I mean, we have really, through our pain and suffering and humility in addressing this and in recognizing the victims, we've also led the way for the rest of the church, and I think the actions
And the
that we
rest of the
saw,
world.
the rest of the world,
in so many other areas.
and Pope Francis and a lot of the reforms he's instituted have really echoed things that we did in the United States, as well as solving additional issues. But I really think this year is going to be an important year for us to reflect on this.
I'm interested in asking a question too related to this, and that is that I remember back in when this broke in 2002 with the Boston Globe story. And I was asked to attend a meeting in Philadelphia. The somebody was Austin Roos was putting together a group of people. Father Grishel was there, Phil Jenkins, the historian, was there, and we thought we were going to have to push back against the mainstream media because they were going to distort this story, you know. Of course, within a few weeks, it was clear that what Boston Globe had was, there's not much you can do with that. This was a terrible story, and we weren't going to have any real influence. But the Dallas Charter came out, and for the most part, and this is why I'd be interested in getting your feedback on this too. For the most part, I was under the impression, writing and speaking with listeners and friends, that people said, okay, this happened, it's terrible, it goes back a long ways, but the bishops have now done something, and let's see how this works in the future. And you know, immediately we began to think that we were seeing a lot of these things had really peaked in the 1970s and into the 80s a little bit, but now it was way down, way down. And then 2018 came around. Mm-hmm. And the McCarrick story opened this up like I would never have imagined. Mm-hmm. People were no longer saying, what are the bishops going to do about this? They were saying, what are we going to do about it? Mm-hmm. And I would say since 2018, this story has gotten worse. We had a long period of time where the story kind of went into the background. Is that your experience too?
I think the problem, again, it goes to trust.
Yeah.
The McCarrick story and the fact that he'd been around for so long and recognized and also admired by a lot of secular journalists.
Yes,
he was very accessible to them. And so the sense of hypocrisy and the sense of betrayal was so strong then. And of course, then other stories came out involving bishops.
Right.
It came out that the charter really didn't address the idea of bishops, and there's a reason for that. But that just ended up leaving the church looking like it had not made any progress.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would say that I think was different in 2018, just looking from a diocesan, local perspective, was that people focused their attention a little bit differently. All politics is local. So McCarrick, while he was some cardinal that most people didn't know about, but you find out there's a cardinal. Well, the fact that he gets laicized in the end was a big deal. Yeah. I mean, that was major. So I think that signaled for some people a shift. But they also, I think a lot of people focus their attention, well, what's happened in my diocese? And as dioceses have put out their list of credibly accused, I think it's given them a sense as to what's happening in my diocese. There might be bad things happening elsewhere. There might be corruption elsewhere. Who's to know, and how do you even figure that out? All I can do is look at my diocese. And I just felt like a lot more people were really focusing their attention locally, which was good, because if you're communicating actively, there's now ears that are receptive to that. I think that was maybe one shift that was healthy in the 2018 that was different, was people were really thinking about my diocese, my bishop, my priest, whereas before it was kind of this general problem that they couldn't really ever pin down.
And you said a key thing, which is if they were communicating effectively. We, as a church, we say the truth will set us free, and that's again where it's so important that whatever Catholic communications effort is in the diocese, that they're upfront in dealing with it, because otherwise it's going to come out in some other way, and then you lose trust again.
I would say also media activity never happens in a vacuum, and from 2002 to 2018, you have the rise of the social media. So we know how people are responding to a degree that would have been impossible in 2002.
Excellent.
And so we're hearing all of these voices expressing their horror at these reports. And also you've got years of built up cynicism about authority, and people's sense of, and this is one of the big themes that I think about a lot with regard to the way people approach media, is their sense of the chaos the world is in right now. And I think one of the great services we can provide as Catholic communicators is to imitate our Lord himself in bringing order out of chaos, in both his creative act and his redemptive act.
Father, help us think through kind of the righteous anger that we might feel. You see these stories, and whether you work for the church, I think sometimes people think that if you work for the church, you don't feel that same anger and just bewilderment that other people do when you hear some of these stories. How do we balance that righteous anger with the virtues we should be also experiencing in the faith? How do we kind of balance that out, where we feel the anger, but we don't take it too far?
Yeah, first I would simply say we ought to affirm that there is such a thing as righteous anger, and that it is in fact righteous. Many of the events we're talking about rightly arouse a certain amount of anger. And, so then you talk about balancing various virtues, which is always part of the Christian life. And, till the ultimate litmus test is charity. Can I love even my enemies? Can I love my enemies within the church? Do I want the best for them? Can I pray for them? Do I want their repentance and conversion if that's what's best for them? Because often that will be the case. That what I'm praying for is that even this bishop repents and converts and believes in the gospel again and becomes a good bishop. And, then I think it's also about trusting in the power of God to make good on his promises, that when we turn to him with our whole hearts, he will answer. And so, I think charity, even though in some ways anger is the antithesis of charity, when we have righteous anger, it really can be harmonious with love of God and love of neighbor.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to focus a few questions just for Greg, Teresa, and Al for a moment. For the three of you, you can, in whatever order, but how have you seen your audiences change over time, and how has your relationship with your audience changed? Whoever wants to go first.
I would say that one of the biggest compliments you can get as a talk show host is that people feel like you're their friend, and especially in Catholic media, because it's so personal in terms of the most important thing that we have, our relationship with God. And I have noticed now that it's, believe it or not, 20 years on the air with Ave Maria, that people really feel that you're a part of your life, and so they're very confident, and they reveal very personal things, and that's a very precious, sacred thing, and to respect that. So I've seen more of a growth in people wanting to reach out and really seeking advice from us, and it's a very, very important thing and a precious thing, but you have to have the humility, as Father said, to say, okay, I am not their spiritual director, I'm a host, I'm a journalist, but I do have sources that I can give them. So I think people look to us, they think they put someone on a pedestal, which we appreciate, but at the same time, we want to realistically tell them, well, we're just out there in the world like you doing our jobs, and so we try to keep that relationship and kind of help them understand the role that we play and provide them with resources.
I think something's really been different for me. Back when I started in the mid-'80s, and I continued on up until probably about the time I came into Catholic media in '97, there was a strong emphasis on trying to find something that's valuable, that other people haven't discovered, that you can give to your listeners. So there was during the satanic ritual abuse panic in the 1980s, I worked with some investigative reporters in California and Chicago to blow apart some of those stories and show the damage that was being done by the satanic ritual abuse thing. And the work got some attention in Christianity Today and other periodicals, and it was good work. Same thing, I managed to do an expose on a fella who claimed to be a convert to historic Christianity, formerly working with this New Age guru. It turns out it was bogus. The whole story was bogus. It was fun, but I enjoyed it. But today, I don't do that kind of thing, partially because so many other people have access to information with just a few phone calls. Those things took a lot of time. I find that what I do more today, being older, more time has gone on, I actually do know more now than I did. I think a lot of time is spent trying to reassure people that this too shall pass.
Right, that's a great point. Yeah.
We have been through, like Teresa said, this is not our first rodeo. We've been here before. And I've seen so many stories. I joke with my producers about this all the time. And I'll say, yeah, well, this is about the 5th time that story's come around.
Yeah.
You've seen it. You know how it's going to pan out. People are going to get excited about it. The press is going to have a field day with it. And then it's just going to go past. And our job is to help build up our brothers and sisters so that we become the men and women we were created to be. That's really what we're about. We're not really even about exposés or news. We're about conformity to Christ. And how can we help one another become the saints that we were created to be.
Greg, what about for you?
Well, I think journalism is a little bit different from radio. I mean, radio has this real immediacy and intimacy, like when you've got, I mean, a lot of times it's in your car, it's just you and the radio and that special bond there. And I do think that with journalism, there is a news element that you have to be true to what your profession is. And I think the church wants you to be true to that profession. And it's not quite the same relationship, though I do, you get the email campaigns if you say something that hits people the wrong way. You do feel that. Much less do you get the letter coming in saying, you're doing a great job, or keep it up. You know? But that comes with the territory. But I do think how people want to weigh in more.
Right.
More one way or another. If you post your story online, there's going to be all sorts of comments. That our rule at our Sunday Visitor was by the third comment, they're actually talking about something else. But they want to weigh in.
What's great though now, and I'll just wrap up with this thought, is when people still contact us and they see us as everything, right? That we're supposed to be investigative reporters, supposed to do all these big stories, and as Al said, we really believe at Ave Maria and EWTN that we're here to really uplift people and keep them focused on Christ and educate each other in the faith. But within the various outlets, especially, for example, EWTN does have these news operations now, EWTN News Nightly, and they have In Depth, and they have Pro-Life Weekly, and the world over. So they have these different shows that really do take a story and develop it in a very, very deep way. So there's, what I see that is really great is there is such a great variety of different outlets to choose from that are doing good, solid Catholic reporting, and in many cases, investigative work.
Father, I want to ask you a question because I think it's a unique phenomenon. Pretty much every priest I can think of, whether you're a religious order or a diocesan parish priest, you have a specific community that's kind of assigned to you. Very few have kind of like, a universal reach. And yet with social media, priests can get on there and all of a sudden they've got reach to people well outside of their parish boundaries or their order's charism and so on. Is that healthy or does it create distractions? Do you see that as valuable or, again, you're looking at it from the perspective too of you have priest friends and, that are serving in parishes, but also you're bringing up seminarians and try to form them to properly manage these tools.
I don't speak German, but I do know the word Jein, which is a combination of yes and no. So I'm going to take the easy way out and say,
all right.
Is it healthy? Yes, very often it is healthy. But no, sometimes it is not healthy. I would say a couple of things about priest involvement in social media, blogging, and that sort of thing. One, it's a matter of discernment. We've been talking about a lot of different issues, and a couple of strands of Catholic spirituality keep coming to mind. One is abandonment to divine providence, and one saint we could attach to that would be St. Francis de Sales. Another is discernment, and St. Ignatius, of course, is the famous proponent of discernment of spirits and of God's will. And priests need to be discerning about whether and how to be engaged with social media, to balance it with their own assigned responsibilities, most often in parishes, and to think carefully about, have we ever come to a consensus about what these social media really are? Some people treat it like a cocktail party.
Right.
Some people treat it like a public square in which our job is to sort of, offer messages to other people. Some people treat it as kind of a gathering of family and friends where I'm sharing the intimate details of my life. And that's where even priests sometimes make mistakes and get, these various sort of paradigms for social media mixed up. So that would be the first point of discernment I would name. And then the second thing is never to forget you're a priest. It's not about advancing your own public or your own private opinions in a way that you would not do in other fora. So the distance created by social media should not embolden us to, reveal more of our private views than we would reveal to our parish or, at a larger gathering of family or friends or that sort of thing. I'm offering some words of caution, but there's a tremendous opportunity. I've been a follower of Bishop Barron's for a very long time. And, Father Mike Schmitz was mentioned before.
Yep.
And there are lots of
Father John
bright
Ricardo,
lights
another
out there.
one, right?
Father John
Right.
Ricardo. And then lots of simple priests who, just post the saint of the day, or, they're
Right.
posting their homilies, or, whatever it is, but they're making a contribution, and they're speaking a word of light in such a dark world, and a word of order in the midst of chaos, and a word of goodness in the midst of so much evil. And so there is a tremendous contribution to be made. And so that's sort of, I'm thinking of three prongs, abandonment to God's providence, discernment, and also evangelization, that mission focus. And that's what, I'm more familiar with Archbishop Vigneron's teaching and writing, and what he does so well is to incorporate all of these strands of Catholic spirituality into an evangelization-focused, missionary orientation for the whole church.
Father, is this part of seminary training? I know you can't speak for all seminaries, but is this something that's becoming incorporated more in kind of the human formation in seminary life, this how you represent yourself online and in social media?
It is. We spoke earlier about the increased psychological sophistication with which we need to approach seminary formation in the wake of the abuse crisis, and that's certainly the case. But it is also the case that we need to help seminarians to be media savvy themselves.
Yes.
I give a 3-hour presentation to the seminarians on engagement with digital media, including the social media. And it's the basic thrust of the presentation is evangelization. So it's about how can we employ these media for the sake of the mission. But within that context, I have to speak about the various cautions that have been raised in our conversation, because we need the seminarians to be discerning, and also to make sure that they maintain their trust in the Lord and His guidance of the church. And we tend to take on too much. We tend to be. It's easy to become a pope myself. To become a messiah myself, and to think that somehow the fate of the church and the world depends on me expressing this opinion right now. And it doesn't. Christ is with us. And just to have that trust in Him as we engage these media fruitfully.
What you're seeing now with a lot of young seminarians, and Father Charlie, you and I have talked about this on the air and also privately before, is that these young men have grown up in this media world, this social media world, that we didn't grow up in. I mean, we had the media, obviously, but not to the extent, and it's so natural for them to weigh in automatically. I know there was an issue where the former rector, associate rector, now Archbishop Burns, brought me in many years ago to do a seminar on this with the young seminarians, because they were noticing they were attacking each other on Facebook, they were doing these things that weren't appropriate, not necessarily something that was immoral in terms of getting into things that they shouldn't be into or looking at, but more of it was the way they were relating to each other, and not a very priestly fashion. So that's a whole nother area that needs to be, I think, looked at, to have more actual media training or media exposure in a way of how do you deal with this. My pastor, I think, is a great example, though, because he always has this column every week. It's really cute. It's called Taller Tales, which is very true because he's almost 7 feet tall. But he always tells a personal story about dealing with his sisters and his family. That, I mean, brings it home for people. He's a real person. He's dealing with real issues. He's fixing this for his mom, or he's helping his sister bake this cake that never quite works out. And there's always funny stories, but it makes him very real. As a pastor and as someone to whom they can relate. That's a kind of communication I think that is very, I think, healthy, that they are out there with family and with people in the real world.
You all have offered so much, but if you give a tweet-length final thought in the spirit of what we're doing here, but just kind of a brief final thought. Greg, we'll start with you and then work down this way. Put you on the spot.
It's an exciting time. It's an exciting time that we're coming into, and in some ways I'm, more near the end of my career than the beginning, and just to look at how much everything's changed. And I think we've heard a lot of really great words today about keeping our focus on Christ, keeping our focus on what serves the church. And I think we'll come out of this okay. We've got some rough waters right now, but I'm more hopeful than not, as you said at the beginning.
So
I'm
you
the
are an
optimist.
optimist.
Right.
You argued with me. Teresa?
I would echo that. I would also say, and because I'm a revert, and I came back to the church, and when I started to read different documents, especially about the media, it was one of those, where have I been all these years? I could have had a V8. So I think keep your eyes focused on Christ, the author and finisher of our faith, and look to the church. Look at these documents that we're talking about. They're so helpful, and and discern what you're consuming. If we're consuming as adults 11 hours of media per day, what are we looking at? What are we watching? And how does it affect your sense of peace? But always at the end of the day, the church is never going to steer us wrong, and take advantage of these different documents that are available.
Very good. Al?
My mother just died 2 weeks ago, and I had the last 2 days of her life I was with her. And watching her die, she died serenely. She had access to the sacraments and the priest. And it was, she gave me life. She gave me new life when she had me baptized. And in her death, she showed me that a happy death, a good death, is achievable. It's not just something a euphemism that we throw out there to protect us from our own fear of mortality. I think we should always remember that. We may not want to put a skull on our desk like they did during the Middle Ages. But this passes awfully quickly. You know, I never thought when I started doing radio, I didn't expect I'd be doing it, you know, when I was 70 years old, you know, and here I am still doing it. And I feel like I'm going to continue doing it for a while, if the Lord have me do it. But when all is said and done, we will face a time where all that we've lived for will be open. God presently sees through us. But in time, who we are will be transparent to everybody. That's how we'll spend eternity, being penetrated by all kinds of people. We should get started doing that now. This is where we begin to be saints. We don't wait for eternal life until our death. We start living it now.
Absolutely,
Amen.
Father.
Can I just take some of what Al said and make it mine? The other one I thought of at tweet length is, if your typing fingers cause you to sin, cut them off.
Okay. I like that.
Jesus Christ is the Word of God. God communicates His truth and His life and His goodness to us. And whenever we communicate, it ought to draw us closer to Christ and to each other. That's what communication is really about. And if we keep
Amen.
our eyes fixed on Christ, we will do very well, and there's always reason for hope in Him.
Amen.
Amen.
Beautiful, perfect, Denny. Thank you all for you're very busy people. So I appreciate we were able to get you all here and do this part two. Thank you so
Thank
much for all
you.
that you do in your ministry, but for your contributions
Thank you.
here.
Thanks, Billy.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Billy. Great to be
Great
with
discussion.
you.
So that wraps up this part two of Digital Transformation in the Catholic Church. To learn more about Ave Maria Radio, which was our host for this part two, go to avemariaradio.net. To learn more about the work that Greg's involved with at the Catholic News Service, go to catholicnews.com. And to read the pastoral letters from Archbishop Vigneron and Bishop Burbidge of Detroit and Arlington, go to unleashthegospel.com and arlingtondiocese.org. Thank you.